There are some endings that happen with a single conversation. And then there are endings that take years, years of hoping, years of questioning, years of telling yourselves that maybe tomorrow will be different. Maybe tomorrow he will look at you the way he used to. Maybe tomorrow the relationship will feel like a marriage again. Maybe tomorrow the promises will finally mean something. But what happens when tomorrow keeps coming and nothing changes? That is where Meri Brown's story becomes so much more emotional than a simple reality TV breakup. Because when people look at Meri and Kody Brown today, they may see an ex-wife who finally moved on, but that is only the ending. The real story is everything Meri had to survive emotionally before she could reach that ending. For years, Meri seemed caught between two different versions of her life. One version was the life she had built with Kody, the family, the memories, the faith, the children, the years together, the belief that somehow, despite everything that had happened, there was still something worth saving. And then there was the other version, the version where Meri had to look honestly at her own life and ask herself a question that can be incredibly painful for anyone to answer. What if I am holding on to something that no longer exists? That question changes everything. And perhaps the most heartbreaking part is that Meri did not seem to arrive at that realization overnight. She arrived there slowly, piece by piece, pain by pain, disappointment by disappointment. And eventually, there comes a moment when a person stops asking, how do I make this work? And starts asking, how do I save myself? That is the emotional heart of Meri Brown's story. And that is why her freedom feels so significant. Because Meri's relationship with Kody had been complicated long before the public finally heard that it was over. Their marriage began decades before Sister Wives ever appeared on television. Meri was not simply someone who joined Kody's life for a few years. She was there at the beginning. She was part of the foundation. She knew Kody before the cameras, before the fame, before the arguments became entertainment for millions of viewers, before the Brown family's private struggles became public conversations. And that history matters, because walking away from a relationship is one thing. Walking away from a life you have spent decades building is something completely different. When Sister Wives premiered, viewers were introduced to Kody, Meri, Janelle, and Christine as a family living a life that was completely different from the traditional family structure most viewers knew. Then came Robyn. And with Robyn's arrival, the emotional balance of the family began changing. For Meri, that transition was especially complicated. She had been Kody's first wife. She had history with him that none of the other women could completely duplicate. But history does not always protect a relationship. Sometimes history becomes the very thing that makes leaving harder. Because when you've spent decades with someone, you're not only saying goodbye to the person, you're saying goodbye to the version of yourself that existed beside them. You're saying goodbye to old dreams, old expectations, old promises, old plans. And sometimes you're saying goodbye to the woman you thought you were going to become. That is why Meri's journey cannot simply be reduced to Kody didn't want her, so she left. There is far more emotion underneath it. There was disappointment, there was rejection, there was loneliness, and there was the painful realization that wanting a relationship to work does not mean two people are equally committed to making it work. Over the years, viewers watched Meri continue to search for clarity. Sometimes she seemed hopeful, sometimes frustrated, sometimes heartbroken. And sometimes she appeared to be trying to convince herself that there was still something left. That emotional uncertainty became one of the most painful parts of her story. Because imagine being surrounded by people and still feeling alone. Imagine having a huge family and still wondering where you belong. Imagine being part of a marriage and still asking yourself whether your husband truly sees you. That kind of loneliness doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like smiling. Sometimes it looks like saying, well, I'm okay. Sometimes it looks like continuing to show up. And sometimes it looks like holding on to a tiny amount of hope long after everyone else thinks you should have let go. Meri did that for a long time. And perhaps that is why her eventual freedom feels so powerful. Because the woman who once seemed desperate for reassurance eventually started realizing that she could give herself the reassurance she had been waiting to receive from someone else. She could stop waiting. She could stop chasing. She could stop asking whether she was enough. And she could finally begin asking whether the life she was living was enough for her. That is a completely different question, and it changes the entire story. By late 2022 and early 2023, the relationship had reached its public conclusion. Kody had previously acknowledged that he no longer considered himself married to Meri, and on January 10, 2023, Meri and Kody publicly announced that they had decided to terminate their marriage. For many viewers, that announcement felt like the end. But emotionally, it was actually the beginning. Because ending a relationship publicly doesn't automatically mean your heart has caught up. A person can know something is over and still grieve it. They can leave and still miss the life they thought they would have. They can know they made the right decision and still cry about what they lost. And that is something people sometimes forget when watching reality television. We see the announcement, we see the headlines, we see the social media posts, but we don't always see the thousands of quiet moments that come afterward, the empty rooms, the memories, the questions, the moments when you suddenly realize that the future you imagine for yourself is no longer going to happen. Meri had to face all of that, and she had to do it publicly. But something else began happening too. Slowly, Meri started talking about worth, about identity, about moving forward, about building something that belonged to her. And that is where the word freedom becomes important. Freedom does not always mean moving to another city. It doesn't always mean finding another relationship. It doesn't always mean becoming famous or successful. Sometimes freedom is simply waking up one morning and realizing, I don't need someone else to decide whether I am worthy anymore. That realization can be incredibly powerful. And for Meri, it seemed to become part of a much larger personal transformation. Her Worthy Up work became associated with that message of self-worth and personal growth, and whether viewers loved Meri, disagreed with her, or spent years criticizing her decisions, one thing became increasingly difficult to ignore. She was building an identity that was no longer centered entirely around being Kody Brown's wife. That is huge. Because for so much of Sister Wives, Meri was introduced through the family. Meri was Kody's first wife. Meri was Leon's mother. Meri was one of the sister wives. Meri was part of the Brown family. But eventually, Meri began becoming something else. Just Meri. Not somebody's wife. Not somebody's sister wife. Not somebody waiting for Kody. Just herself. And that transformation is where the emotional story really begins. Because the most difficult part of leaving is not always physically leaving. Sometimes the hardest part is mentally leaving. You can move out of a house and still live inside the memories. You can change your relationship status and still carry the old expectations. You can say you're done and still secretly hope that the other person will suddenly realize what they lost. That is why true freedom takes time. And perhaps the most powerful thing Meri has done is not simply walk away from Kody. It is learning to stop defining her value through his approval. Think about how different that is. For years, the question seemed to be, does Kody still love me? Now the question becomes, do I love the life I am creating? Those are completely different questions. One puts your worth in somebody else's hands. The other puts it back in your own. And that is where Meri's story becomes relatable far beyond Sister Wives. Because you don't have to live in a plural marriage to understand what it feels like to stay somewhere because you're afraid of what comes after leaving. You don't have to be famous to understand what it means to hold on to a relationship because of history. You don't have to be on television to understand the fear of starting over. Millions of people know that feeling. The feeling of thinking, what if I leave and regret it? What if I never find anything better? Ah. What if I am too old to start over? What if everyone thinks I failed? Those questions can keep people trapped for years. But eventually, another question becomes stronger. What if staying cost me more than leaving? That may be the question Meri eventually had to confront. And once she did, everything changed. Because freedom can be terrifying at first. When someone has spent years living according to a relationship, suddenly having complete control over their own future can feel unfamiliar. What do you want? Where do you want to live? Who do you want around you? What kind of relationship do you want? What makes you happy? What are your boundaries? What are your dreams? Those questions sound simple. But after years of putting someone else's needs, expectations, or approval ahead of your own, they can feel enormous. Meri had to rediscover those answers. And the woman viewers saw after the breakup was not exactly the same woman they had watched years earlier. There was a different energy, a different confidence, a willingness to talk about her own worth, and most importantly, a willingness to move forward. That doesn't mean the past suddenly disappeared. It didn't. And it doesn't mean every wound was magically healed. It wasn't. Freedom doesn't erase pain. Freedom gives you the space to heal it. And that distinction matters. Because there is a temptation in reality television to turn every breakup into a simple victory story. She left, she's happy, end of story. But real life isn't that simple. Sometimes you can be happier and still sad. You can be stronger and still remember the pain. You can forgive someone and still never want them back. You can appreciate your past without wanting to return to it. And you can love who you once were while becoming someone completely different. That is what makes Meri's journey so compelling. She doesn't need to pretend that the past never happened. She doesn't need to erase Kody from her history. She doesn't need to convince everyone that every moment was terrible. She can simply say, that was my life then. This is my life now. And there is tremendous power in that. But just when you think Meri's story is only about her relationship with Kody, there is another layer, because recent conversations around the Brown family's upbringing have brought renewed attention to the experiences of the children who grew up inside that world. In August 2026, Leon Brown spoke publicly about their childhood, describing the religious environment they grew up in as a cult and saying they had been shy and fearful as a child. Leon also indicated that this was only the beginning of sharing their story. That development doesn't erase Meri's journey, but it adds another emotional dimension to the Brown family story, because suddenly viewers are not only looking at what happened between the adults, they're also thinking about what it meant to grow up inside the family system. And that raises difficult questions. What did the children see? What did they understand? What did they carry with them? And how much of the family's history will eventually be discussed openly? Those questions are now part of the wider conversation surrounding the Browns. And for Meri, that makes the idea of freedom even more complicated. Because when you leave a family structure, you don't necessarily leave every emotion connected to it. You still have memories, you still have family relationships, you still have history. And sometimes the hardest part isn't escaping the past. It's learning how to live peacefully with it. Meri's story is not simply Kody broke her heart. It is Meri had to rebuild her identity after realizing that the relationship she had spent years trying to save was no longer the future she wanted. And that is much more powerful, because in the end, freedom isn't about winning against Kody. It isn't about proving that Meri was right and Kody was wrong. It isn't even about getting revenge. The deepest form of freedom is reaching a point where revenge no longer matters, where you don't need the other person to regret losing you, where you don't need them to apologize, where you don't need them to finally understand your value. You know your value, and that is enough. Meri's journey toward that point is what makes this story worth talking about, because after years of uncertainty, she finally had something she had been missing for a very long time: choice. Choice over her future, choice over her relationships, choice over her time, choice over her time, choice over her identity, and perhaps most importantly, choice over whether she would continue waiting. She no longer had to sit around wondering when Kody would choose her. She could choose herself. And maybe that is the real meaning behind the phrase, Meri found her freedom, not because somebody gave it to her, not because Kody suddenly changed, not because the past disappeared, but because she finally realized that her future did not need anyone else's permission. And that brings us to the question that makes the next chapter even more interesting. If Meri has truly moved beyond the life she once shared with Kody, what does she want now? Is she looking for love? Is she looking for companionship? Is she completely comfortable being independent? Does she still carry emotional scars from the years she spent fighting for a relationship? And most importantly, after spending so much of her life being defined as one of Kody Brown's wives, who is Meri Brown when she no longer needs that title at all? That is the question we need to explore next. Because leaving Kody may have been the ending of one chapter, but for Meri, it may have been the first page of the life she was finally free to write for herself. There is something people often misunderstand about freedom. They think freedom begins the moment you walk away, but sometimes walking away is only the beginning. The real freedom comes later. It comes when you stop checking the door, when you stop wondering whether someone is coming back, when you stop imagining the apology you wish you would receive, when you stop replaying old conversations in your head, and when you finally stop asking, why wasn't I enough? That is the part of Meri Brown's story that deserves more attention. Because for years, her emotional journey seemed to revolve around one painful question: was there still a place for her beside Kody? But after the relationship ended, the question began changing. It became, what kind of life can I build without waiting for somebody else to choose me? And that is a completely different kind of journey. Meri had spent years inside a family structure where her identity was deeply connected to being a wife. She was introduced to viewers as part of a plural marriage. Her relationship with Kody was part of the family's foundation. Her history with him went back decades. So when that relationship finally ended, she wasn't simply losing a husband. She was losing a role, a role she had carried for most of her adult life, and replacing that role wasn't going to happen overnight. Because when you've spent years being known as someone's wife, you eventually have to rediscover who you are when that relationship is no longer defining you. And Meri began doing exactly that. She started putting more attention on her own life, her work, her friendships, her travels, her goals, her personal growth, and most importantly, her own voice. That change matters because there was a time when Meri seemed to spend enormous emotional energy trying to understand Kody's feelings. Did he still love her? Did he still want the marriage? Was there hope? Was she being rejected? Could things change? Those questions consumed so much of the story. But now, the most interesting part is that Meri doesn't need to live inside those questions anymore. The relationship has ended, the uncertainty has ended, and whatever pain remains belongs to the past. That doesn't mean the memories disappear. It means they no longer control the future. And that distinction is incredibly important because healing doesn't mean forgetting. Healing means remembering without being destroyed by what you remember. And Meri appears to be building exactly that kind of life. A life where her happiness doesn't depend on whether Kody approves of her. A life where she doesn't have to compete for attention. A life where she doesn't have to wonder where she stands. A life where she can make decisions because they are right for Meri. And honestly, after everything viewers watched her go through, that may be the most satisfying part of her story. Not revenge, not another dramatic confrontation, not Kody suddenly realizing what he lost, just peace. There is something incredibly powerful about a woman who no longer needs to prove anything. And that is where Meri's journey becomes much bigger than Sister Wives. Because people watching at home may recognize themselves in her story. Maybe they have stayed too long. Maybe they have waited too long. Maybe they have spent years hoping someone would finally appreciate them. Maybe they have confused history with love. Maybe they believe that because they had already invested so much, they couldn't possibly walk away. But Meri's story raises a difficult question. How much of your future should you sacrifice just because you've already invested so much in your past? That's not an easy question because people naturally think about sunk time. They think about the years, the memories, the family, the promises, the sacrifices. They think, I have already given so much. I can't start over now. But sometimes starting over isn't starting from nothing. Sometimes you are starting with everything you learned. And Meri has learned a lot. She learned what she wants. She learned what she doesn't want. She learned what loneliness inside a relationship feels like. She learned how painful uncertainty can be. And she learned that waiting indefinitely for another person's decision can slowly become a decision against yourself. That may be the biggest lesson of all, because there is a difference between patience and self-abandonment. Patience says, well, I'm giving this situation time because I believe there is something worth building. Self-abandonment says, I'm ignoring my own needs because I'm terrified of what happens if I stop waiting. For years, viewers debated which one Meri was doing, but eventually she had to answer that question for herself. And when the relationship finally ended publicly in January 2023, that chapter was no longer something she needed to negotiate. It was over. Now she could move forward. And moving forward meant confronting another emotional reality. What happens when the person you've been waiting for is no longer the person you need? That can be surprisingly freeing because sometimes we spend years imagining that happiness will arrive when somebody else changes, when they become more affectionate, more available, more understanding, more committed, more loving. But what if happiness doesn't require them to change? What if it requires you to change what you are willing to accept? That is where Meri's transformation becomes so powerful. She didn't need Kody to suddenly become the perfect husband. She didn't need him to rewrite the past. She didn't need him to validate every painful experience. She needed to understand that her life could continue without waiting for those things. And that is exactly what freedom looks like. But there is another emotional layer to this story. Meri's future isn't just about escaping the past. It is about deciding what comes next. And that is where things become fascinating. Because when someone has spent decades in one relationship structure, independence can be both exciting and frightening. Suddenly, there is no script, no expectation, no role telling you what you are supposed to do. You have to create the next chapter yourself, and Meri began doing that through her work and her personal projects. Her Worthy Up message became increasingly connected to ideas of self-worth, confidence, and personal growth. And there is something almost poetic about that. Because for years, Mary's sister wives' story involved questions about whether she was valued within her marriage. Now she was building a platform around the idea that people should understand their own worth. That transformation didn't happen randomly. It feels connected to the emotional lessons of her own life. You can see why the message resonates, because when someone has experienced rejection or uncertainty, eventually they have to make a choice. They can spend the rest of their life trying to convince someone else that they deserve love, or they can decide, I already deserve it. That is a powerful shift, and it is also why Meri's post-Kody chapter may ultimately be more interesting than her marriage itself, because her marriage was about whether the family structure could survive. Her new life is about whether Meri can finally thrive, and those are very different stories. For years, the question was, will Meri and Kody reconcile? Today, a more interesting question is, what happens when Meri no longer wants reconciliation? Because when someone stops waiting, the entire power dynamic changes. You can't control someone who no longer needs your approval. You can't keep someone emotionally trapped with uncertainty when they've learned to live without an answer. And you can't make someone feel rejected when they've stopped asking to be chosen. That's why the phrase, she finally found her freedom, carries so much emotional weight. Freedom wasn't Kody's punishment. It was Meri's reward. And perhaps the most important part is that she didn't need to destroy him to rebuild herself. She simply had to move forward. That may be one of the hardest things to do, because anger can be easier than acceptance. Anger gives you someone to blame. Acceptance forces you to look forward, and looking forward means admitting that the relationship you once imagined is not coming back. That can hurt. Even when you know it's the right decision, even when you are happier, even when you are stronger, you can still mourn the dream. And Meri had a lot to mourn. She wasn't only mourning Kody, she was mourning the future she believed she was going to have, the family structure she once imagined, the relationship she thought would eventually become what she wanted, the years she believed would lead somewhere different. That's a very specific kind of grief. You are not grieving only what happened, you're grieving what didn't happen. And sometimes that is even harder, because you can't point to one perfect memory and say, that's what I lost. You're grieving a possibility, a future that existed in your imagination, a version of life that never arrived. And when you finally accept that, you have to create a new future. That is what Meri appears to be doing. She is not trying to recreate the old life. She is creating something else, something that belongs to her. And that brings us to another question people often ask. Will Meri ever find love again? Maybe. Maybe she won't. And honestly, that doesn't have to be the most important question, because for the first time, Meri doesn't need another relationship to prove that she is okay. She doesn't need a new husband to prove that Kody was wrong. She doesn't need a romantic partner to prove that she is desirable. And she certainly doesn't need another marriage to prove that she has moved on. Sometimes the biggest transformation is realizing that your life can be complete without filling every empty space with another person. If love comes, it should add to her life. It shouldn't rescue her from it, and that is a much healthier place to begin from. Because when you are desperate for someone to save you from loneliness, you can accept things you shouldn't. But when you are already comfortable with yourself, you can choose a relationship because you genuinely want that person in your life, not because you're afraid to be alone. That distinction could shape Meri's next chapter, and it could also explain why she seems more comfortable embracing her independence. She's already proven she can build a life outside the Brown family structure. She has work, she has friendships, she has a public platform, she has her own goals, and she has something she didn't seem to have for much of her marriage: complete control over her own direction. But there is one thing that makes this chapter especially emotional. Meri didn't get here without scars. The past still exists, the public criticism still exists, the difficult moments still exist, the things said on television still exist. The years of uncertainty cannot simply be erased. But scars are evidence that something healed. They are not proof that you are still broken. And perhaps that is the difference between the Meri viewers once watched and the Meri they see now. The old Meri often seemed to be searching for an answer. The new Meri seems more interested in creating her own. And that is a beautiful transformation. But there is another piece of the Brown family story that cannot be ignored. Leon Brown's recent decision to speak publicly about their childhood has reopened conversations about what growing up in the Brown family's religious environment actually felt like. Leon described that upbringing in deeply critical terms and called it a cult, while indicating that they intend to share more about their experiences. That development could become one of the most significant emotional storylines surrounding the Brown family going forward. Because when children grow up, they eventually become adults who can tell their own stories. And sometimes those stories are very different from the story their parents believed they were creating. For Meri, that means the past may continue to be discussed even as she tries to build her future. But perhaps that is another part of freedom. You cannot control how other people remember the past. You can only control what you do with your own future. And Meri seems to have reached a place where she is no longer trying to control the entire narrative. She's simply living. And that may be why her story feels so different now. There is no need for a dramatic revenge moment, no need for a huge confrontation, no need for Kody to come running back. The victory is quieter. It's waking up and realizing you don't miss the chaos. It's discovering that peace is not boring. It's realizing that being alone can be healthier than feeling alone beside someone. It's laughing again without wondering whether somebody approves. It's making plans without waiting for someone else's permission. It's looking in the mirror and recognizing yourself. And maybe after all those years, that's what Meri finally found. Not just freedom from Kody, but freedom from the version of herself who believed she had to keep waiting. And there is one final question that makes the next chapter impossible to ignore. If Meri no longer defines her future around Kody, what happens when someone new enters her life? Would she ever allow herself to love again? Would she trust differently? Would she set stronger boundaries? Would she refuse to settle for being someone's second choice? And what would a relationship look like for a woman who has already learned how painful it is to lose herself inside one? Those questions are not about whether Meri needs another man. They are about whether the woman she has become would ever accept the kind of relationship she once accepted. And that may be the biggest change of all, because once you've learned your worth, you don't walk back into the same cage just because someone paints it a different color. You look at the door, you remember how hard it was to open, and you choose to keep walking. Meri's story is not finished. In many ways, it may have finally begun, because the woman who spent years wondering whether Kody would choose her finally realized she had been waiting for the wrong person to make the decision. She could choose herself. And now the question isn't whether Meri can live without Kody. The question is, how much bigger can her life become now that she no longer has to live around him? There is a moment in every painful relationship when something inside you changes. Not loudly, not dramatically. Sometimes nobody else even notices. You simply wake up one day and realize you are tired of waiting. Not tired because you stopped caring. Not tired because the memories suddenly disappeared. You are tired because you finally understand that waiting has become its own kind of pain. And for Meri Brown, that realization may be one of the most important parts of her entire journey, because for years, so much of the conversation surrounding Meri and Kody came down to one question: would Kody ever choose Meri again? But what if that was the wrong question? What if the real question was, when would Meri finally stop needing him to choose her? That is a completely different story. And perhaps that is why Meri's life after Kody feels so emotionally powerful, because there was a time when the future seemed to depend on what Kody wanted. If he wanted the relationship, there might be hope. If he changed his mind, there might be reconciliation. If he showed affection, maybe things could improve. If he opened the door, maybe Meri could walk back through it. But eventually, Meri had to realize something that many people discover after years of emotional uncertainty. You cannot build your future around someone else's indecision. At some point, you have to make your own decision, and Meri did. Their marriage was publicly ended in January 2023. But emotionally, that ending was not a single day. It was the conclusion of years of disappointment, confusion, hope, and heartbreak. And that's why saying Meri left Kody doesn't fully capture what happened. She wasn't simply leaving a man. She was leaving a version of her life. She was leaving expectations. She was leaving a role. And perhaps most importantly, she was leaving the idea that her worth depended on whether Kody wanted her. That last part may have been the hardest, because rejection can make people question themselves. You start wondering, was I not attractive enough? Was I not supportive enough? Did I do something wrong? Why wasn't I chosen? And when those questions repeat for years, they can become part of your identity. But eventually, you have to challenge them. Maybe the question isn't, why didn't he choose me? Maybe the question is, why did I believe his choice determined my worth? That shift can change someone's entire life. And Meri's journey increasingly became about that shift. She started focusing on herself, her work, her independence, her friendships, her future, and her message around self-worth. Her Worthy Up platform has become closely associated with encouraging people to recognize their own value and move toward personal growth. And there is something deeply symbolic about that because Meri spent years living through a public relationship where viewers constantly debated her value inside the family. Now she is building a life where her value isn't something other people get to vote on. That is freedom, not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind nobody can take away. And perhaps that is what makes her story more relatable than people realize. Because many people have experienced relationships where they felt like they had to earn love. They had to be more patient, more understanding, more forgiving, more accommodating. They kept thinking, if I just try harder, maybe things would finally change. But relationships cannot survive on one person's effort. And love cannot be sustained by one person constantly proving that they deserve it. At some point, you have to ask whether the relationship is giving you life or slowly taking it away. Meri's journey forces viewers to think about that question because sometimes staying looks like strength. People say, she's loyal. She never gave up. She fought for her family, but there is another side to that. Sometimes staying isn't loyalty. Sometimes staying isn't loyalty. Sometimes staying is fear. Fear of starting over, fear of being alone, fear of what people will say, fear of losing the identity you've known for decades. And sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is admit, I don't want this anymore. That sentence can be terrifying because once you say it, there is no hiding from the truth. And Meri eventually had to face that truth. But here's the thing. She didn't become a completely different person overnight. She still had memories. She still had complicated emotions. She still had family connections. She still had years of history. Freedom doesn't mean becoming emotionless. It means emotions no longer control your decisions. That's an important difference. Meri can remember Kody without wanting him back. She can appreciate the good moments without pretending the painful ones never happened. She can acknowledge the history without returning to the relationship. And she can move forward without hating the person she once loved. That's maturity. And it may be one of the most important lessons from her story because people sometimes believe moving on requires anger. They think you have to destroy the past. You have to expose everything. You have to make the other person regret losing you. But real healing can be much quieter. Sometimes it sounds like, I wish you well, but I'm not coming back. And that sentence contains enormous strength because it doesn't ask for revenge. It doesn't ask for validation. It doesn't ask for permission. It simply closes the door and then you walk away. That may be the emotional meaning behind Meri's final break. Not simply the legal or public end of the relationship, but the emotional decision to stop living as though Kody's next move will determine hers. That is the real break. And once you understand that, Meri's recent life looks very different. She is no longer waiting for the family structure to tell her who she is. She is defining herself. She is creating her own routines. She is building her own work. She is traveling. She is spending time with people who make her feel valued. She is creating experiences that belong to her. And perhaps the most beautiful part is that she doesn't need to explain every choice. She doesn't have to convince everyone that she's happy. She doesn't have to constantly prove that leaving was correct. She simply has to live. And sometimes living well is the strongest answer you can give. But then came another development that reminded everyone that the Brown family's past is still very much alive. Leon Brown's recent public comments about their childhood have reopened conversations about the environment in which the Brown children were raised. Leon has described that upbringing in deeply critical terms, including referring to it as a cult, and has suggested that there is more of their story that they intend to share. That matters because the Brown family story is no longer only being told through Kody's perspective. The adult children have their own voices, their own memories, their own interpretations, and as more of those voices emerge, viewers may begin seeing the family history differently. For Meri, that can be emotionally complicated because family history doesn't simply disappear when a marriage ends. The past continues to exist. And sometimes when one family member speaks publicly, it can reopen wounds that everyone thought had already been closed, but Meri cannot control what other people say. And perhaps that is another part of her freedom. She can listen, she can reflect, she can have her own perspective, but she doesn't have to return to the old life. She doesn't have to become trapped in the same emotional cycle. She can continue forward. And that's important because there is a danger in constantly looking backward. If you spend all your time trying to understand why someone hurt you, you can accidentally give them control over your future. You keep replaying the story. You keep analyzing every moment. You keep asking what you could have done differently. And eventually, the past becomes your entire identity. Meri appears to be moving in the opposite direction. She's building a future, and that future doesn't have to erase the past. It simply has to be bigger than it. Think about that. Your past can be painful. It can be complicated. It can contain mistakes. It can contain regrets. But it doesn't get to decide what happens next. That's the message at the heart of Meri's transformation. And maybe that's why her story resonates so strongly with people who have gone through difficult relationships themselves. Because sometimes you don't need another person to give you closure. You have to give yourself closure. Sometimes there will never be the perfect apology. There will never be the perfect explanation. There will never be a final conversation where everything suddenly makes sense. Sometimes closure is simply deciding, I'm not carrying this anymore. And that is incredibly powerful. Meri doesn't have to spend the rest of her life proving that she deserved better. She can simply live better. She doesn't have to convince Kody that he made a mistake. She can create a life where his opinion no longer determines her happiness. She doesn't have to make him jealous. She doesn't have to make him regret anything. She doesn't have to win because she already won the moment she stopped abandoning herself. And that's the part that people may overlook. When you choose yourself after years of choosing everyone else, it can feel selfish at first, but sometimes it isn't selfish. Sometimes it's necessary. You cannot keep pouring from an empty cup. You cannot keep giving emotional energy to a relationship that gives you nothing back. You cannot keep shrinking yourself to fit into a life that no longer fits you. At some point, something has to change, and Meri changed, not perfectly, not overnight, but enough to begin again. And now there is a new possibility in her life that didn't exist before. She gets to decide what love means to her. She gets to decide what respect looks like. She gets to decide what boundaries are non-negotiable. She gets to decide what kind of person deserves access to her life. And perhaps that is where her next chapter becomes even more interesting. Because if Meri ever chooses another relationship, it will not be the same Meri who once spent years waiting for Kody. She knows what emotional uncertainty feels like. She knows what it means to feel unwanted. She knows what happens when communication breaks down. And she knows how painful it can be to stay in a relationship while feeling alone. So if love comes again, she may recognize the warning signs much earlier. She may refuse to settle. She may understand that being alone is not the worst thing that can happen. Sometimes being with the wrong person is worse. And that is a lesson many people only learn after years of pain. Meri has already lived through that lesson. So perhaps her greatest romantic transformation isn't finding another partner. Maybe it is learning to trust herself, to trust her instincts, to trust her boundaries, to trust that she can survive being alone, and to trust that she doesn't need to accept less simply because she's afraid there won't be anything else. That is confidence. Real confidence. Not pretending that nothing hurts, but knowing that even if something hurts, you will survive it. And that may be the strongest version of Meri we've ever seen. The woman who once seemed trapped in the question of whether Kody would choose her now has the freedom to choose herself every single day. And that's why her story isn't really about Kody anymore. Kody may always be part of her history, but he doesn't have to be the center of her future. That is the difference. And perhaps the most emotional moment isn't the day Meri announced the marriage was over. Maybe the most emotional moment is the day she realized she could finally say, I'm okay without you. Not because she never loved him, not because the past didn't matter, but because she finally learned that love for someone else should never require you to abandon love for yourself. And that brings us to one of the biggest questions surrounding Meri now. What happens when the woman who spent years trying to hold on to a family finally realizes she is free to create one on her own terms? Does she redefine what family means? Does she build deeper relationships outside the Brown family? Does she find a new kind of love? Does she continue focusing on personal growth? Or does she simply enjoy the freedom she fought so hard to find? Whatever comes next, one thing is already clear. Meri's story did not end when Kody stopped choosing her. It began when she stopped waiting to be chosen. And that is why her freedom matters. Because sometimes the most powerful ending isn't when he finally realized what he lost. Sometimes it's she finally realized what she had to gain. And Meri's next chapter may be exactly that. A chapter where she doesn't ask permission. A chapter where she doesn't wait. A chapter where she doesn't chase. A chapter where she doesn't measure her worth through somebody else's love. A chapter where she finally gets to be Meri. And if you thought the end of her marriage was the most emotional part of this story, wait until you see what happens when we look at the life she is building now, because the biggest surprise may be that Meri isn't simply moving on from Kody. She may be becoming the woman she never had the freedom to become before. There is a strange thing about endings. Sometimes the ending you feared for years becomes the beginning you desperately needed. And sometimes, after spending so much time wondering what your life would look like if a relationship finally ended, you discover something unexpected. You survive, you breathe. You wake up the next morning, and eventually you smile again. That may be the most important part of Meri Brown's story. Because for years, the possibility of completely separating from Kody seemed frightening. There was history. There was family. There were memories. There was an entire identity built around being part of the Brown family. And there was the question that seemed to follow Meri everywhere. What happens to her if Kody is no longer part of her life? But now we can ask the opposite question. What happens when Meri finally realizes that her life belongs to her? And perhaps the answer is much more beautiful than anyone expected. She doesn't disappear. She doesn't collapse. She doesn't stop living. She begins again. And starting again after decades is not easy. It takes courage. It takes patience. And sometimes it takes admitting that the life you worked so hard to preserve was never going to become the life you hoped it would be. That realization can break your heart, but it can also set you free. Meri's story is powerful because she isn't a woman who walked away with nothing. She walked away with experience. She walked away with lessons. She walked away knowing exactly what emotional loneliness feels like, and she walked away knowing that she never wanted to lose herself like that again. That's important because when people talk about moving on, they sometimes imagine that it means forgetting, but moving on isn't forgetting. It's remembering differently. The memories are still there. The years are still there. The good moments are still there. The painful moments are still there, but they no longer determine what happens tomorrow. And that is what Meri's freedom represents. Not erasing Kody, not pretending the marriage never existed, but refusing to allow that chapter to become the entire book. And that distinction could be the most important thing about her transformation. For so long, viewers knew Meri primarily through her relationship. Meri and Kody. Meri and the sister wives, Meri and the Brown family. But now there is another identity emerging. Meri as an independent woman, Meri as a businesswoman, Meri as someone who talks openly about self-worth, Meri as someone creating a life outside the role she was given. And that is something no one can take away from her. Not Kody, not the cameras, not the critics, not even the people who still remember the old Meri, because people change. And sometimes the person you become after surviving something is stronger than the person you were before it. That's what makes her story emotional. She didn't simply escape a relationship. She discovered parts of herself that had been buried underneath years of expectations. And maybe that is what happens when you finally have space to hear your own voice. For years, there were so many voices around Meri, Kody's, the other wives, the families, the viewers, the critics. The expectations of their faith, the expectations of marriage, the expectations of being part of a television family. And somewhere inside all of that noise, there was Meri trying to figure out what she wanted. Now she finally has the room to listen. And what she does with that freedom is entirely up to her. That is what makes the future so interesting, because there is no longer a husband deciding whether the relationship continues. There is no longer a question of whether she will be accepted back into the marriage. There is no longer a need to wait for someone else's decision. Meri gets to decide. And after years of uncertainty, choice can feel like a miracle. But freedom also comes with responsibility. Because when nobody else is deciding your future, you have to decide it yourself. You can't blame another person for every disappointment. You have to figure out what you want, what makes you happy, what makes you feel safe, what makes you feel valued, and what you will never accept again. That process can be uncomfortable, but it can also be incredibly empowering. And Meri's emphasis on self-worth fits naturally into that transformation. Her Worthy Up work has focused heavily on helping people think differently about their own value. And perhaps the reason that message carries so much emotional weight is because it reflects a lesson Meri herself has had to learn. Your worth isn't determined by whether somebody chooses you. Your worth doesn't disappear because someone falls out of love with you. Your worth isn't reduced because a relationship ends. And your age doesn't determine whether you deserve a new beginning. Those are lessons that become especially important when starting over later in life. Because society often tells people that they have a deadline. By a certain age, you should have everything figured out. By a certain age, you should have the perfect relationship. By a certain age, starting over is supposed to be embarrassing, but life doesn't work that way. People change, relationships change, dreams change, and sometimes your greatest chapter begins after the chapter you thought would last forever finally ends. Meri is proof of that possibility, and maybe that is why the word freedom fits her story better than a breakup. A breakup describes what happened between two people. Freedom describes what happened inside one person, and that internal change is much more significant because Kody can be removed from the relationship, but only Meri can remove the emotional power that relationship had over her. That's the real victory. And perhaps there is another important lesson here. You don't have to hate someone to leave them. You don't have to call the entire relationship fake. You don't have to say every moment was terrible. You can simply accept that the relationship no longer belongs in your future. That's enough. Meri can acknowledge that Kody was a major part of her life. She can acknowledge that they shared history. She can acknowledge that there were good memories, and she can still say, I'm moving forward. Those two things can exist together, and that's a much more mature form of closure. But as Meri moves forward, the Brown family's wider story continues to evolve. Leon Brown's recent public discussion about their childhood has created another emotional layer around the family's history. Leon has described their upbringing in extremely critical terms and referred to the religious environment as a cult, while also indicating that more of their experience may eventually be shared. That is significant because the Brown family story is no longer only about marriages. It is about generations. It is about what the children experienced. It is about how those children interpreted the world they grew up in, and it raises questions that could continue affecting how viewers understand the family. But Meri's response to all of this is not something we can know unless she chooses to speak about it herself, and that is important. We shouldn't write her emotions for her. We shouldn't assume what she thinks, because perhaps another part of her freedom is simply having the right to decide what she shares. After spending so much of her life on television, privacy itself can become valuable. Sometimes you don't need to explain every feeling. You don't need to respond to every criticism. You don't need to correct every person online. You don't need to tell the world what you're doing every second. You can simply live. And that may be exactly what Meri is learning. Not every chapter needs to be performed. Some chapters are meant to be lived. And maybe that is why her post-Kody life feels different. The goal isn't necessarily to create another dramatic storyline. The goal is to create peace, real peace, the kind that doesn't need an audience, the kind that doesn't depend on ratings, the kind that doesn't require someone else to lose for you to win. Because if Meri's happiness depends on Kody being miserable, then Kody still has power. But if Meri can be happy regardless of what Kody does, then she is truly free. And that is a much bigger victory. Think about the emotional journey. At one point, she seemed to be waiting for a relationship to become what she wanted. Then she began accepting that it might never happen. Then she faced the end. Then she began rebuilding. And now she has an opportunity to create a life based on her own choices. That's not one dramatic moment. It's a process. And processes are rarely perfect. There may be days when the past hurts. There may be moments when memories return. There may be holidays that feel strange. There may be family moments that remind her of what once was, but healing isn't measured by never feeling sad. It's measured by what you do when the sadness comes. Do you go backward or do you keep moving? And Meri's greatest challenge now may be resisting the temptation to romanticize the past simply because the future is uncertain. That's something many people experience. When you're lonely, you remember the good. When you're scared, you remember the familiar. Even an unhealthy situation can feel safe simply because you know it. But familiar isn't always healthy, and loneliness isn't always a sign that you made the wrong decision. Sometimes loneliness is simply the space between the old life and the new one. That space can be uncomfortable, but it can also be where transformation happens. And Meri has already crossed a huge part of that distance. She isn't the woman she was when she first entered the Brown family. She isn't even the woman viewers saw during the most difficult years of her marriage. She is older, more experienced, more independent, and hopefully more certain about what she deserves. That's what makes her future so intriguing, because if love comes again, it will meet a different Meri. A Meri who knows that love should not require constant begging. A Meri who knows that companionship should not feel like rejection. A Meri who knows that commitment has to go both ways. A Meri who understands that boundaries aren't cruelty, and a Meri who knows she can survive without anyone. That last part changes everything, because the healthiest relationships often begin when two people don't need each other to survive. They choose each other. And if Meri ever chooses love again, perhaps that is the kind of love she will want. Not a relationship built around obligation, not a relationship built around fear, not a relationship where she has to compete for attention, but one where she feels seen, heard, respected, and wanted. Whether that person exists in her future is impossible to know. But the important thing is that Meri doesn't have to rush. She doesn't need to fill the space Kody left. She doesn't need to prove anything. She can take her time. And that is another form of freedom. The freedom to wait for something healthy instead of settling for something familiar. That may be one of the greatest lessons of her story. Because sometimes the biggest mistake people make after leaving a difficult relationship is immediately searching for another one. They want someone to fill the silence, someone to prove they're desirable, someone to erase the loneliness. But healing doesn't always require another person. Sometimes healing requires sitting with yourself long enough to realize that you are not empty. You are simply becoming someone new, and Meri has an opportunity to do exactly that. To discover what makes her happy without asking anyone else. To travel because she wants to work because she enjoys it, to spend time with people who genuinely support her, to make decisions without fear, to wake up and know that the day belongs to her. That is freedom. And perhaps that is what Kody can never take away, because he may be part of her history, but he cannot own her future. And there is something deeply satisfying about that, not because she won, but because she stopped playing the game. She stopped measuring her value against someone else's affection. She stopped waiting for the relationship to give her permission to live, and she started living anyway. That is the real transformation. And it brings us to the final question. When people look at Meri now, should they still see her as Kody Brown's former wife? Or should they finally see her as a woman who spent years inside a complicated family structure, survived an emotionally difficult ending, and then built an identity that belonged entirely to herself? Maybe that's the real ending, not. Well, Meri finally left Kody, but Meri finally found Meri. And perhaps that is why this chapter feels so emotional, because sometimes the person you spend your whole life trying to find isn't another person, it's yourself. The woman underneath the expectations, the woman underneath the marriage, the woman underneath the public image, the woman underneath everyone else's opinions. And when you finally meet that woman, you don't want to lose her again. Meri's future is still unfolding. There will be new decisions, new opportunities, new challenges, and maybe even unexpected surprises. But whatever comes next, she has something she didn't have before, a life that is hers, a future she controls, and the freedom to decide what happens next. So maybe Kody wasn't the final chapter after all. Maybe he was simply the chapter that taught Meri how important it is to write the next one herself. And if that's true, then her greatest story has only just begun, because the most powerful ending isn't when someone walks away from you. It's when you realize you no longer need them to stay. And that is the freedom Meri Brown finally found.